the maze that rewrote the rules. When Elijah moved into the quiet cul-de-sac of Sycamore Ridge, he thought he'd finally found peace. After 20 years in the Navy and the heartbreak of losing his wife to cancer, he craved nothing more than solitude, the gentle hum of cicadas at dusk, and a patch of earth he could call his own. His house backed onto what was supposed to be a protected green belt, a sanctuary of whispering trees and wildflowers untouched by concrete or committees. But what Elijah didn't know was that nestled among the manicured lawns and matching mailboxes lurked a force more tenacious than any storm he'd weathered at sea: HOA President Karen. She arrived on his property like an entitled monarch inspecting her domain, waving at his security camera as her massive Great Dane defiled the koi pond he'd built with trembling hands in memory of his wife. The violation didn't stop there. 2 teens trampled through his flower bed, kicking apart the irises he'd planted for her birthday, her favorite flower, while one of them stared down the lens and mockingly saluted before chucking a soda can onto Elijah's patio. That was the moment something inside him snapped, not with rage, but with cold, calculating resolve. This wasn't just trespassing. This was war. The shortcut, as they so casually called it, had turned his sanctuary into a thoroughfare. A private haven had become public domain, claimed by entitlement and convenience. Karen mocked his no trespassing signs, replacing them with ones that read community path, enjoy the walk. When Elijah presented legal land surveys at the whole meeting proving there was no easement, no shared access, Karen chuckled as if humoring a child. Sometimes, she cooed, you just have to go with what works for everyone. But everyone didn't include Elijah. He wasn't just brushed, the city was erased. When polite requests turned into jeers, and treasured garden gnomes were shattered by stray soccer balls, the ache of his wife's absence merged with fury. That night, in a quiet workshop that still smelled of her favorite jasmine oil, Elijah laid out blueprints not for revenge but for justice, sculpted in hedges and steel. He would not scream. He would not sue. He would outsmart. The pain, the humiliation, the loneliness, it all poured into his design. He would turn his yard into something unforgettable. Karen had declared war with passive-aggressive smiles and smug latte-sipping apathy. Elijah would answer with silent engineering precision. He poured a glass of whiskey, stared at the flickering cursor of a digital blueprint titled Maze V1, and whispered to the night, "Let's see you shortcut through this." The man who had dismantled bombs now plotted a masterpiece of deterrence, not to destroy, but to disorient, to humble, to reclaim sacred ground through cunning, creativity, and a storm of righteous indignation masked behind the art of landscaping. By the time the first hedge was planted, Elijah felt something shift, not in the soil, but in himself. Each root he pressed into the earth anchored him a little more, tethering him not to the past, but to purpose. The maze was no longer just an act of retaliation, it was a resurrection of control, of dignity. He worked before sunrise and after sunset, when the cul-de-sac was quiet, and Karen was likely inside drafting her next email filled with Fox-concerned passive aggression. He called it landscaping to curious neighbors. To Karen, who strutted by with her signature oversized sunglasses and queen coffee mug, it was just a quaint little garden project. She had no idea. The hedges came in thick and fast, were cultivated by a friend at a nursery Elijah once helped protect during a wildfire back in California. He layered them with rotating lattice dividers and installed motion-activated sprinklers that hit with a 2-second delay, just enough to drench the last in line. His background in naval logistics gave him an edge. Every turn was calculated, every choke point engineered for maximum psychological disorientation. Reflective panels bent perception, audio emitters hidden in birdhouses whispered just out of reach, and false scent trails tricked even the most determined dog walkers. When Karen finally wandered in with her posse, Elijah sat upstairs, watching every confused pivot, every shriek of frustration, every soaked pair of yoga pants. He didn't laugh. He didn't gloat. He simply sipped his coffee, cool and measured, as his creation did exactly what it was meant to do: humble those who trespassed without a second thought. But he knew Karen wouldn't stop. Her pride was a fortress, brittle and grand. Sure enough, within 48 hours of the incident, Elijah received a formal complaint from the HOA subject line: community disruption due to unapproved landscape structures. He pinned the letter beside his monitor with a tack and a smirk, and below it, scribbled in black Sharpie, "Phase 2 begins." The maze, he decided, would evolve. It would become smarter, crueler without ever crossing a legal line. He upgraded the sound system, adding recorded snippets from past whole meetings. Karen's voice echoed at dead ends, repeating phrases like "we must maintain community standards." He adjusted the LED stake lighting to glow misleadingly at night, programmed exit routes to randomize every 90 minutes, and reinforced weak spots with iron posts disguised in planters. The whole structure pulsed with silent defiance, a living organism trained to repel entitlement. But more than that, it became a message, one that said, "This land is mine, my peace is mine, my grief is mine, and you will not stomp through it with your lattes and leashes and your breathtaking lack of shame." The maze wasn't just a boundary anymore. It was Elijah's line in the sand, a line drawn not with anger, but with brilliant, relentless clarity. Karen had played her hand. Now Elijah was playing his calm, cunning, and 2 moves ahead. Elijah had expected retaliation, but he hadn't expected it to come dressed in khakis and wielding a clipboard. The man arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, mid-60s, stiff posture, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. He stood just outside the property line, pretending to admire the landscaping while making notes on a thick pad of paper. When Elijah stepped outside to greet him, the man introduced himself as an independent safety assessor, a title vague enough to scream trouble. At the HOA's request, he said, without offering a badge, ID, or even a business card. Elijah narrowed his eyes. "This is private property," he replied evenly. "You so much as step 1 inch across that fence line without my permission, and you'll be violating state trespass laws." The man didn't argue. He just offered a smug little shrug and muttered, "We'll see about that," before disappearing down the sidewalk. Elijah didn't wait. That night, he double-checked every boundary marker, every document. He called his attorney, who laughed for 5 solid minutes before advising, "They've got nothing, but document everything. And if they keep pushing, push back harder." That was all Elijah needed to hear. Phase 3 was born. Signs went up, professional, tasteful, and legally bulletproof. Laminated notices at each entrance now read, "Private property. Do not enter without explicit permission." Surveillance in use. But Elijah didn't stop there. Near the main entrance, he mounted a decorative sign shaped like a jester's mask, etched with a message that read, "Caution. Those who enter without consent may leave without dignity." It wasn't a threat, it was a prophecy. That weekend, at 12 a.m., his cameras captured exactly what he'd anticipated: 2 figures, one wielding bolt cutters, the other with a flashlight creeping through the darkness. They tried to breach a concealed lattice reinforced with steel wiring. Sparks flew. Nothing gave. One of them slipped into the mulch trap and triggered the rooster screech. They scrambled away in a panic, tripping over their own feet. Elijah submitted the footage to local police and emailed it. Subject line: "Attempted property sabotage, security footage at a chat to the whole board." Karen didn't respond directly. Instead, the next morning, Elijah found a large envelope duct taped to his door. Inside was a formal notice declaring his landscape structure under community review for violations of neighborhood harmony, obstruction of view, and psychological disturbance to residents. Psychological disturbance. Elijah laughed so hard he nearly dropped his coffee. He showed the letter to Angela, the retired school principal down the street. She took one look, snapped a photo, and posted it in her private Facebook group with the caption, "When the queen of the HOA loses at her own game." The post went viral locally. Parodies followed. One neighbor remixed the letter into a sea shanty. Elijah didn't need revenge anymore. The community had taken up the banner. His mace had become a symbol, not just of resistance, but of wit, defiance, and the power of one man's refusal to be trampled. And as Karen scrambled behind the scenes, Elijah added one more note to his planning board: Phase 4, let them try. It was only a matter of time before Karen brought in the big guns. Elijah knew her type. People like Karen didn't lose quietly. They didn't learn, reflect, or retreat with grace. No, they escalated, because they had to believe the world still bent to their will. So, when the city code enforcement officer showed up at the next HOA board meeting, Elijah wasn't surprised. He was surprised, however, by the Timming hadn't been invited to defend himself. Karen was stacking the deck. But what she hadn't anticipated was Dennis, a tired but sharp-witted board member who'd grown increasingly disillusioned with her antics. Dennis slipped Elijah a copy of the meeting minutes before the vote, and what those minutes revealed nearly made Elijah choke on his coffee. Karen had formally declared his maze a public nuisance, citing emotional distress, confusion, and potential injury to pets. The kicker. She claimed that the hedge maze had caused one of her followers to experience a temporary loss of spatial awareness. Elijah read it twice just to be sure it wasn't satire. But fate, as it often does when ego runs too hot, delivered a final twist. The code enforcement officer had already visited Elijah's property earlier that day, quietly, and found nothing out of compliance. In fact, the only issue he had flagged was the HOA's unauthorized signage posted on Elijah's fence. Karen's doing. When that revelation dropped in the meeting like a brick through a stained glass window, Karen exploded. She accused the board of betrayal, the officer of favoritism, and the entire community of being ungrateful and easily manipulated. Miriam, the retired judge, simply leaned forward and said, "Karen, you've been trespassing and misleading this board for months. Maybe it's time you composed yourself or accused yourself." The room was silent. Karen stormed out. The next morning, Elijah stepped outside to find that the whole message board had changed. A new proposal was posted. Term limits for whole leadership positions. It passed by a landslide. And then, like a toxic fog finally lifting, things got better. Karen was absent from the usual walking group. The clipped passive-aggressive notes taped to mailboxes disappeared. The HOA's email threads exploded with vague threats and policy citations grew quiet. And then came the letter. Karen had resigned. She claimed the environment had become hostile and unsupportive of community leadership. Someone printed copies of it and left them at the clubhouse with a doodled cartoon maze on each page. Elijah didn't gloat. He didn't have to. The neighborhood had spoken, and the maze thrived. What began as a tactical defense had transformed into a cherished feature. Kids ran through it for fun. Couples wandered it at sunset. Elijah added trivia posts, planted seasonal flowers, and even set up a picnic corner for weekend visitors. Somehow, the thing he'd built to reclaim solitude had drawn people together not in chaos, but in curiosity and joy. Karen had tried to control the community through rules and fear. Elijah had accidentally rebuilt it with laughter, hedges, and a little sprinkle of poetic justice. Spring arrived with a gentleness Elijah hadn't felt in years. The air was lighter, the streets quieter, not empty, but calm. Neighbors who once darted glances over fences now waved without hesitation. Children left handwritten notes near the maze's entrance, "Best maze ever," and Karen got owned, scrawled in glitter pen and crayon. Elijah never replied, but each one he tucked carefully into a drawer in his study, the one he had quietly converted into a command center. Lined with monitors that still fed live footage from the maze. It had started as defense, then evolved into satire, and no strangely it had become a kind of community monument. Every weekend brought visitors, from curious residents to wandering teens daring each other to survive the lavender gauntlet. Elijah added trivia signs about local history, installed soft fairy lights for twilight walks, and reprogrammed the sprinkler timing to activate only in response to an authorized entry after dark. He never expected what came next. One Saturday morning, while clipping a particularly stubborn hedge, a woman approached him with a boy maybe 8 or 9 years old, with wide, curious eyes and a hesitant gait. "Hi, I'm Lisa," she said gently. "We just moved in down the road. This is my son, Adam. He's on the spectrum. Loves puzzles, patterns, the way things fit together. He's been talking about your maze for days." Elijah felt something catch in his chest. The tactical obstacle course he designed for trespasser deterrence had somehow become a fascination for a child looking for magic. "Would it be okay if he walked through it?" Lisa asked softly. "Only if it's not too much trouble." Elijah knelt down, looked at Adam, and smiled. "You know," he said, "I made this maze for people who don't follow the rules. But I think it's even better for people who want to explore." With that, Adam slipped into the hedges like a sailor charting a new sea. Elijah watched, heart full, as the boy tapped the lattice panels, giggled at the rooster sound, and beamed every time the speakers whispered "wrong turn," with just enough drama to delight. Lisa stood beside him, tears brimming in her eyes. "You could have just built a wall," she said. "Most people would have, but you made something better." That moment rewrote everything for Elijah. What had begun as a battle of stubbornness and boundaries had become something far more profound. The maze had never just been about keeping people out. It was about forcing them to think, to reflect, to respect the path, not just the shortcut. That evening, Elijah sat at his desk, looked over the maze's schematics, and added a final component, a stone bench at the heart of the labyrinth, beneath the old oak tree. On its back, he engraved a phrase of his own making: "Respect is the only real shortcut." He didn't tell anyone where the quote came from. He didn't need to. By then, the maze had already spoken for him, and the message had taken root in every twisted turn, every damp sneaker, and every neighbor who now understood that imagination, not anger, had built this place. Elijah never imagined that a maze born out of frustration would one day attract the attention of people far beyond his sleepy cul-de-sac. It started innocently enough after Lisa posted a heartfelt story about Adam's joyful walk through the maze on her parenting blog. The post began to circulate. It wasn't just the visuals, how the fairy-lit hedges and quirky sound effects were mesmerizing. It was the intention behind it that resonated. A maze designed not for escape, but for reflection. A garden built not to punish, but to inspire boundaries and curiosity in equal measure. Within a week, a local journalist reached out. Elijah hesitated at first, wary of dragging the spotlight back onto himself after everything with Karen. But when the reporter arrived with a genuine smile and a notebook full of thoughtful questions, Elijah agreed. The story ran under the headline, "The Maze That Brought a Neighborhood Together." It was cheesy, sure, but it caught fire. A city council member showed up 2 days later with his son, who declared the maze 10 times better than Minecraft. Elijah chuckled at that high praise in the digital age. But the part that truly floored him came in a formal envelope, stamped with the county seal. The letter invited Elijah to a small civic awards ceremony recognizing innovative community projects. His technically dubbed a transformative conflict resolution through creative landscape architecture had made it onto their radar as a case study. Elijah had to read the letter 3 times to believe it. He'd never set out to make a statement. He just wanted peace. But somehow, through twisted latticework and lavender-scented booby traps, he had sparked a kind of local movement. One that said rules don't have to be shouted, they can be whispered through hedges and mirrored paths. The night before the event, Elijah stood in the center of the maze, just beneath the old oak tree where the stone bench sat with its now famous inscription. He ran his fingers along the carved phrase, "Respect is the only real shortcut." He'd etched those words during a storm of grief and defiance, but now they meant something entirely new. They weren't just a warning. They were a reminder that peace doesn't come from control, it comes from creativity and courage. At the awards ceremony, Elijah felt out of place in his blazer, but when the host called his name, he stood tall. The applause wasn't thunderous, but it was sincere. One speaker called his maze a masterclass in conflict transformation. Another dubbed it performance landscaping. Elijah just smiled. When asked what advice he'd give others dealing with overreach or unfairness in their communities, he answered simply, "Use your brain, use your heart, and don't be afraid to be a little weird about it." The audience laughed, but it landed, because deep down, everyone understood. It wasn't just a maze, it was a metaphor. A declaration that sometimes the best resistance doesn't scream, it grows. And in the case of Elijah's backyard, it grew into something no one, not even Karen, could trim back. After the awards ceremony, Elijah returned home to a quiet he hadn't felt since the early days before the shortcut, before the chaos, before Karen. But this silence wasn't born of tension. It was the kind of peace that comes when people finally understand where the boundaries are, and more importantly, why they exist. The maze had done more than protect Elijah's yard, it had changed how the neighborhood saw itself. What once was a tightly controlled, passive-aggressive HOA haven had transformed into a place where creativity was celebrated over conformity. Residents who once blindly followed Karen's mandates now came to Elijah for advice about gardening, landscaping, even how to handle disputes. It was strange, surreal even, to be seen not as the cranky man with cameras, but as a kind of local sage. He didn't seek the role, but he didn't turn it away either. Especially because it wasn't about ego, it was about keeping the spirit of the maze alive. And yet, even as the community healed, Karen's shadow hadn't completely vanished. Whispers started to float in. Word was that Karen had relocated to a development on the other side of town owned without an HOA. The ultimate irony. Someone said she tried to start a neighborhood Facebook group there, but within 3 posts, she'd already been booted for being overly directive. Elijah didn't gloat when he heard that. He just smiled softly, sipped his coffee, and returned to trimming a particularly stubborn hedge. A week later, A postcard arrived in his mailbox with no return address. On the front was a photo of a hedge maze, and on the back, scrawled in shaky handwriting, "Still can't find my way out." Elijah didn't need a signature. He knew. And somehow, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a quiet surrender. Meanwhile, the maze continued to evolve. He added solar-powered fairy lights that glowed at dusk, casting a soft, magical shimmer through the winding paths. Kids began calling it the backyard labyrinth, and someone even dropped a Google Maps pin labeled "Escape from Karen." Elijah hadn't made it, but he left it. The right was oddly poetic. That same week, a teacher from the local elementary school asked if she could bring students on a field trip to explore it. Elijah said yes. The children arrived wide-eyed, marveling at the twists and turns, the trivia plaques, the sound cues, the playful misdirections. He gave a short speech, nothing fancy, just a few words about imagination, respect, and what it means to create something meaningful in the face of conflict. One student, no older than 10, raised her hand and asked, "Did you make this to get back at someone?" Elijah paused. Then he smiled. "No," he said. "I made it to remember that you can fight for something without hurting anyone. You can build your peace and still let others find joy in it too." That answer was simple. HOA seemed to settle into the roots of the maze itself. Elijah didn't just defend his land. He redefined what it meant to belong. By the time summer rolled in, Elijah's backyard maze had transcended its original purpose. It was no longer just a clever response to overreach or even a beloved local landmark. It had become a destination, a story shared between families, passed down like folklore. Children who once tossed soda cans over his fence now brought their younger siblings to test their bravery. Retirees made it part of their morning walk. Teenagers competed for who could find the exit fastest, while adults lingered to read the trivia plaques or admire the subtle artistry woven into each turn. Elijah had added more than new hedges and lights. He'd begun layering meaning into every part of the maze. Certain corners now featured quotes from famous peacemakers, quiet reminders that strength and softness aren't opposites. One loop ended at a mirror with a sign overhead, "The challenge isn't the maze, it's how you face it." And yet, for all the attention, Elijah never let it become a circus. He refused sponsorship offers, turned down interview requests from national outlets, and politely declined a reality show producer who wanted to create maze wars. "This wasn't built for fame," he said quietly to his lawyer. "It was built for clarity." But something was shifting inside Elijah, something he hadn't expected. The maze had started as armors of green meant to keep the world out. Yet the longer it stood, the more it invited the world in. And now, people didn't just visit for the novelty. They came seeking peace, reflection, even healing. One Sunday morning, Elijah found a note left near the oak bench at the center. "I came here angry. I left whole. Thank you." No name, just that. He read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it beside Adam's first drawing of the maze, a crude but charming spiral that now lived in a frame above his desk. That same week, Elijah received a formal letter from a state education committee. They wanted to use his maze as part of a case study on conflict resolution and alternative community building. "We believe your project demonstrates the power of creative non-confrontation," it read. Elijah laughed at the phrase. Creative non-confrontation was one way to describe it. But recognition brought weight. More people meant more eyes, and more eyes meant more scrutiny. A few whole loyal instruments of Karen's former circle began to resurface, grumbling about unfair attention and claiming Elijah had turned the neighborhood into a theme park. He heard the whispers, but he didn't react. Instead, he added something new to the maze's second bench, placed near a quiet bend in the path with a view of the koi pond. On it, he carved a fresh inscription, "Let others talk. You keep building." It wasn't just for the visitors. It was for himself. Because the truth was, Elijah had built more than a deterrent, more than a message. He'd built a legacy on that would twist and turn long after he was gone, and still whisper to those who dared take the shortcut. Not everything worth reaching comes easy. And not every wall is meant to keep you out. Sometimes, it's meant to guide you home. Elijah had built the maze to reclaim his peace. But now, it was beginning to reshape more than just his yard. It was shaping lives. The community around him had changed. The same neighbors who once peeked through blinds with suspicion now waved openly, invited him to block parties, even brought by seedlings hoping he'd give planting advice. The maze, in its quiet brilliance, had become a kind of community heart. And yet, as its popularity grew, so did a strange pressure Elijah hadn't anticipated. A few parents asked if he'd consider turning the maze into a nonprofit mindfulness park. A local therapist wondered if she could hold guided meditative walks through it. Someone even pitched a book idea about the man who beat the HOA with hedges. At first, Elijah chuckled at it all. But then came the unexpected, a request from the city council, asking if he would consider chairing a new neighborhood advisory committee focused on creative urban planning and conflict mediation. Him, the man who once poured whiskey over property maps muttering about lawn trespassers, Elijah didn't answer right away. He stood in the center of the maze that night under the canopy of solar lights, his hand brushing the plaque on the bench. Respect is the only real shortcut. That phrase had become a mantra not just for him, but for dozens, maybe hundreds who had wandered the twisted paths and come out quieter, changed. But as the maze grew, so too did the legacy of Karen's Reed now bite in silence. Whispers circulated that she had filed a formal complaint with the city, claiming Elijah's maze had become a public fixture operating without a license. It didn't carry much legal weight, but it was enough to trigger an official inspection. Elijah welcomed the city official with calm grace, offering tea as they walked the winding paths together. The man, perhaps expecting a petty hedge wall, left the yard humbled, smiling faintly as he muttered, "This isn't landscaping. This is something else entirely." But the incident reminded Elijah that even a peaceful garden could become political when power was involved. He wasn't just the old vet with a clever lawn anymore, he was becoming a symbol. And symbols attract scrutiny. So, Elijah did what he always had. He planned. He made backups of every document, every video, every legal survey. He brought in a few volunteers to help maintain the maze, quietly training them on how it worked, how to reset the panels, monitor the sensors, water the hedges. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation, because for the first time, Elijah realized something profound. He wouldn't be around forever, but the maze could be. If handled right, it could become a permanent part of the neighborhood, a space not just for defense, but for growth. He didn't build it for glory, but now that it had become something greater, he felt a quiet duty to protect it, not from intruders, but from being forgotten or twisted by those who didn't understand its heart. The maze wasn't finished, not yet, and neither was Elijah. Valuable lesson. Sometimes, the strongest stand you can take doesn't come through anger, confrontation, or power. It comes through creativity, patience, and quiet determination. Elijah's story teaches us that boundaries don't always need to be enforced with force. They can be reinforced through ingenuity and respect. What began as an act of defense against overreach became a symbol of thoughtful resistance and community transformation. Instead of reacting with hostility, Elijah responded with purpose, turning conflict into connection and turning his personal pain into a shared place of reflection and joy. The maze he built reminds us that true leadership isn't about control, it's about understanding, about showing that you can assert yourself without harming others, and that the most lasting change often comes from those who act not out of ego, but out of principle. In a world so quick to shout, Elijah showed the power of building something that speaks for itself.